Uh, Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first in a new series of presentations uh, regarding hate crime and associated topics. And these are run by the British Society of Criminology Hate Crime Network. We've had a list of very good speakers, and we are starting a new academic term, and we've got some new speakers lined up for you. It's actually a pleasure to do these because it usually involves quite a diverse audience. I mean, it's recorded and it's latterly distributed as well. So it's quite a far-reaching audience. It's been a long summer. I've met some nice people during the summer, including Piotr, who's with us this afternoon. I always have trouble at this time of year packing up the martini bottles on my yacht and finding a dry dock to put it in. But after that, we can settle down for the new academic year. Piotr is with us this afternoon. He's an academically highly acclaimed person, and he's not only got a pan-Europe view of academia of hate crime and associated topics, but he's also educated in many different countries around Europe as well. So, you know, as far as Europe is concerned, he's quite an expert. Piotr has had his MA from the University of Warsaw. His PhD, I see, was undertaken at University College London. You've worked in OSCE. You've worked for the Council of Europe. My goodness. You did your postdoc fellowship in Brussels. And above all, you're a nice guy. And you've just joined the University of Leicester as an associate professor. So what more could a person want? Europe, of course, is seen often as a whole. But actually, it's a place of great difference. It's a place of pockets of difference, of culture, of political interest, and of different peoples. But often it's seen as one geographical space, especially when people in this country are examining Brexit and everything around that. But I recall on the topic of European hate crime, reading Mark Sherry's book, Mark Sherry's edited volume, when there was a chapter within there by Beta Borowska-Beza, who was thinking about the amputation of disabled people and the post-communist hate crime atmosphere in Poland, which was fascinating. And with Piotr's work, much of his work, as I said, was focusing on the EU, including hate crime legislation. But also is looked to the south and east of Europe, to Georgia and to Macedonia and places like that. So what we're getting today is a fascinating insight from different perspectives, from different countries, from different views of hate and how it's working through countries which are not very far from us in geographical terms. So, Piotr, if you'd kindly talk to us and present for around 40 minutes, and then we'll invite questions and answers. So welcome to you and good afternoon.
Thank you, David. This has been absolutely the best introduction that anyone's ever given to me. Absolutely, thank you very much for that. And this is, it's a pleasure to be here. For those of you who don't know, booking a place in this seminar series, it's sort of something that takes about 9 months. The wait time is quite long. So this just shows how important and how popular this series is. And I'm absolutely privileged to be here. It's a great pleasure. And it's also a great pleasure to talk to you about this topic, which has been the topic of my 2-year research fellowship at the Free University of Brussels, where I undertook my postdoctoral fellowship. And what I want to address today will be really will be the issue of how countries respond to hate crime, in particular anti-LGBTI hate crime, outside of the major countries where a lot of research has already been done and a lot of research is being done. And I will be focusing specifically on one country, which is Georgia, which is a country in the east of Europe that has quite different political conditions, and the situation is quite different from what we might know from the west of Europe or North America, where most hate crime research country concentrates in. So I think this is going to be this should be interesting to see what political conditions can influence how a country responds to hate crime, whether the country introduces criminal legislation, and whether that legislation is finally implemented. So this is really what this speech today is going to be about. And why I chose Georgia? So Georgia is this really interesting country that has a lot of issues in the political agenda that show just how difficult it is to be a country, a post-communist country, a post-Soviet country, right on the doorstep of Russia, that has, you know, this really big neighbor that has imperialist aspirations to the degree that 1/5 of Georgia's current territory is under Russia's effective occupation. And at the same time, Georgia is a country that has a government that is popularly seen at the moment as being pro-Russian in its policies. It's a government that has recently tried to advocate for a type of a foreign agent law that would bring organizations, civil society organizations, human rights organizations that receive funding from international donors and international organizations. These organizations will be branded as the so-called foreign agents. So this is very much a Russia type law. At the same time, this is a country that where the former president, one of people who was crucial in putting Georgia on the sort of democratic road, this person is now in prison and in really bad health conditions. And despite this really bad health condition, he is not being released from prison, and he's not receiving the proper medical care. And at the same time, the current president, who is a very strong EU advocate in Russia, she is facing impeachment procedures for which are proposed by the current government. So this is also a country where for many years, over a decade now, all the attempts to organize pride events, LGBTI pride events, have met with severe violence from the general public, if you want to call it that way. But essentially, what I'm talking about is violent attacks by mobs of extreme right-wing people, but also clerics, also members of political parties. And these attacks are not sort of completely bottom-up. They are orchestrated and sponsored by political leaders. And this happens every year, despite the government promising that there's going to be safety, that there's going to be security, that human rights are going to be upheld. This never happens, and every year the same problem is being repeated. And at the same time, this is a country where, despite this pro-Russian government, 80% of people strongly want to be part of the European Union. They want to be part of NATO. They want to, very few countries in the world, you will see as many European flags as in Georgia. And for many years, Georgia has been on this path of learning and becoming more democratic, strengthening its institutions, building legislation around human rights, around the rule of law, around administration, and trying to put things in order to become part of the democratic family, in order to in order to, in the future, gain EU membership. As part of that, Georgia has also made really critical steps in fighting crime, in terms of organized crime, corruption, but also the topic of today, in fighting hate crime. And this is something that I now want to put in more of a broader context. So hate crime legislation is, on the one hand, it's an old thing. On the other hand, it's a very new thing. So laws against racism have been around the world for several decades, sometimes 7 decades, sorry. So around 70 years. But the sort of newer type of hate crime legislation that includes sexual orientation, gender identity, disability. These laws actually make rounds around Europe and other parts of the world now. So there has been a huge spike of legislation, particularly, let's say, about sexual orientation, hate crime in Europe since the year 2000. The numbers have doubled. And Georgia is one of the countries that actually has this kind of legislation. And is the only country in its region, in this east part of Europe, that has this kind of legislation. At the same time, it's a country that for many, many years did not apply this legislation in practice at all. So it was a country that had really beautiful laws on the books since 2012, but nothing to show that the legislation is being applied. And given the situation that we see every year during the Pride events, you would think that Georgia does nothing about hate crime, that this is just laws on the books, but no law in action. Yet there is actually quite a surprise here as well. So what has happened recently and has been pretty much unacknowledged, both in Georgia and outside of Georgia, is the fact that Georgia has actually started to use these laws in the past 4 or 5, maybe 5 years. And this is something that has actually skipped the attention of many people, apart from people who are really, really working in this area. And this is quite interesting. So in general, in Europe, you have this situation where you have a bunch of countries that have hate crime legislation, and they use this legislation quite well. Then you have a bunch of countries that have really good legislation, state-of-the-art legislation, particularly in the Balkans, where this legislation is pretty much never used. Then you have a bunch of countries like Poland or Italy, where there is no anti-LGBTI hate crime legislation, but somehow the police are able to detect a certain number of crimes, record them, and these get prosecuted and sentenced. And then you have Georgia, that for many years did nothing but had law, and suddenly it has sprung up with 133 cases recorded in 1 year, much more than any other country in the region, more than most countries in Europe. So this is just a very, very surprising result in terms of policy, and particularly surprising for me in terms of research, because there is pretty much no research on hate crime in this region. Very little information that we could try to explain theoretically how this can happen. That you have this really weird picture of Europe with those really surprising results, and you have this one small country on the doorstep of Russia that has this amazing result in terms of numbers of crimes that have been recorded by the police. Yet again, you have the situation where in the public eye, Georgia does nothing about hate crime, allows violence during Pride, and only has basically just bad press. So I wanted to kind of just see what's behind the number, what's behind the press releases, and try to understand really what the response is in Georgia to hate crime, in particular anti-LGBTI hate crime, because I see this as the sort of point where if you recognize sexual orientation hate crime, you recognize gender identity hate crime, then that kind of means that you understand what the hate crime concept is. So you understand that hate hurts regardless of the bias motivation behind the crime, and that there is just a lot of parallels between racism and xenophobia and anti-Semitism and homophobia and prejudice based on other characteristics such as disability or gender. So when a country starts to understand that, when a country starts to record cases, starts to respond to victim reports, starts to prosecute these cases and then sentence these cases and provide competent victim support, then you can say that actually progress really has been made beyond just doing, lip service by passing laws that are never used in practice. So this essentially is what this research has been about. And in terms of the research design that you see in front of you at the moment, the project that I undertook included 2 case studies, Georgia and North Macedonia, both of which are small countries in the peripheries of Europe. I know how it sounds kind of funny, but this also means that they are not often looked at in terms of, not often looked at also by researchers. Main data collection method was expert and elite interviews. And this includes civil society experts and activists. This includes politicians, civil servants, officials, and academics, and people working in international organizations. And in terms of analysis, what I try to use is the process tracing methodology, which, for those of you who are not familiar with political science methods, this is a qualitative methodology that tries to actually prove causation. So it's not about correlations. It's going beyond simply narrating something and describing something, trying to actually find a causal relationship between events that happen one after another. And what I want to present to you today will be part of the analysis, sort of a preliminary analysis of some of the events that have happened in Georgia in the past years that have led to the situation where you have at the moment. So the way I'm going to address this in the next 10 minutes or so, I will talk about timeline, and I will try to place things on the timeline, which I wanted to make sort of as cheesy as possible, and I wanted to. This is not forced in a way. I would say actually this is somehow how I just really felt that the timeline made sense to me. It may change later. But essentially, I want to speak about some periods in the recent history of Georgia where the hate crime legislation, an approach to hate crime legislation has changed, and try to explain how these changes happened. So starting from 2010, 2012, this is the first period where Georgia has a revolution of roses, strongly states that they want to be on the Euro-Atlantic integration path. They express the will to join the European Union. They express the will to join NATO. And they seem to be very, very receptive to the ideas and the reforms that are proposed by, let's call it, the West or international organizations. So at this moment, there is no hate crime legislation in Georgia, and there is a real big problem with racism and violence against national and ethnic minorities and religious minorities. So international organizations that review Georgia's human rights record, they say, seems like you should have hate crime legislation. At the moment, we're talking mainly about racism, or actually really only about racism, and violence against LGBTI people is not really a thing that is in the public eye at the moment. The Pride has not yet been organized, and this is not really a public sort of policy problem. At the same time, hate crime legislation is not a big public policy problem in the sense that nobody actually cares about hate crime legislation. Nobody knows what this entails. Nobody is really interested in something that is just very, very technical. So what happens is that hate crime legislation is proposed in the parliament. There is a little bit of a sort of typical democratic process, and then hate crime laws is passed and put on the bookshelves. So essentially what happens is that the law is just not going to be used for almost a decade or over a decade. And what happened was that the law that was proposed was initially a law about racism only. But human rights organizations, when they understood that this is being proposed, came into the parliament and said, hey, what about we also add some other characteristics such as sexual orientation, then the law will be more comprehensive, and it's going to be in line with what the international organizations want from us, because it's going to be in line with the EU anti-discrimination policies. And this is accepted without any problem. Nobody has any issues with this. This is accepted. There is very little parliamentary debate, no public debate in the media, nothing like that happens. So it's very low visibility, no opposition. Everything that happens is just sort of like almost like this behind the scene lobbying. And this lobbying in this way is very, very effective. What Georgia gets from this is a promise from the European Union that the negotiations towards membership are going to progress, and soon in 2012 there is an opening of a dialogue between the European Union and Georgia on opening the visa regime. So Georgian citizens will be able to come to will be able to come to the European Union without having to apply for a visa. And then the hate crime legislation, you can now start to see that this is actually going to be part of a broader process of reforming legislation and practices in Georgia in order to align them with the practices and legislation in the European Union. And this includes broader rule of law issues, criminal justice issues, institutions, legislation on non-discrimination, on gender violence, also the minority issues, and everything that happens, like all the political buzz, is about harmonizing legislation with what the European Union wants. So if something can be branded as an EU law, if you put this little EU flag on a bill that you propose, it's going to be expedited. It's gonna go quite quickly. The problem starts to appear with the anti-discrimination legislation. So the anti-discrimination legislation, the civil anti-discrimination legislation, not hate crime legislation, this actually gets really, really politicized about 2013, 2014, and this is where when the pushback starts to show. So when in 2012 there was pretty much no public interest in LGBTI issues, in 2012 we have the first attempt to organize an LGBTI public event in Tbilisi, in the capital of Georgia, and this event is violently attacked and dispersed by extremists, and this goes soon to this case will go to the European Court of Human Rights and will then become a landmark judgment on how states should respond to anti-LGBTI hate crimes. But only then, or maybe around that time, LGBTI issues actually start to get more in the public start to be more visible for the public eye, and anti-discrimination legislation becomes the bone of contention. So the opponents start to frame it as an assault on Georgia's traditions, as an assault on Georgia's morality, assault on Georgia's national identity and religious identity. And this is becoming an issue that gets extremely politicized. So when in 2012, we still had the time to pass hate crime legislation, in 2014, there is no more room to pass anti-discrimination legislation, and all the efforts to try and promote the LGBTI legislation, all these efforts become pretty much futile at this moment. So what happens at the moment when you cannot really have any political progress or any legal progress? What happens is that civil society organizations decide to take action in a different way. So what they do is they organize, they train themselves, they build the capacity. And one of the things that they did, on the one hand, they start to help victims, they collect cases, they conduct strategic litigation efforts. They take cases through the court system, proving that, trying to sort of test whether legislation actually works in practice or not. And they also do international advocacy. So something that is not quite common, or has not been quite common before. For the first time, as an LGBTI organization, Georgia's LGBTI organization takes a case to the European Court of Human Rights, saying that Georgia violated the European Convention because it failed to respond properly to violence during Tbilisi Pride event in 2012. And the judgment comes back in 2015, 3 years later. And in the judgment, the European Court of Human Rights strongly condemns Georgia for failing to address anti-LGBTI violence. The court calls this hate crime, and pretty much equals this to failure to respond to racist hate crime. And in this way, Georgia actually becomes a country that has really helped to cement the European standard on how states should respond to hate crime. Now, this is really a very cold shower for the government, because the government can do a lot of things, but it definitely does not want to be criticized by international organizations, particularly if this means that the progress towards the EU membership could be in danger. So essentially, what we get is some people within the government see that there is a need to actually maybe start to take this thing seriously in order not to get any more rebukes from the international community. Still, the topic is very politicized, so it's very difficult to work on these things in public. Now we have the next period. In the next period, between 2016 and 2020, more or less, we have a bit of a sort of good developments, where the recommendations of the European Court of Human Rights, the recommendations of other international organizations such as the European Commission on Racism and Intolerance are starting to be implemented. So the government opens an office that will work on hate crime. The ombudsman gets more competence. The prosecution services get more involved in prosecuting hate crime, and all these things together with finally the passage of anti-discrimination legislation after many months and years of fights, all these years, and sort of give Georgia the benefit that the country wanted, which is the final EU visa liberalization regime. So this is a really welcome gift, showing that all these efforts, even if they are quite unpopular, that they can be that they will yield really good results. So in specific terms, for example, the European Commission on Racism and Intolerance recommended that within the Ministry of Interior, there should be a special police unit that will address hate crimes, that the country should finally start to record hate crimes that are being reported to the police, and that the police and prosecution services should be trained to recognize and properly address hate crimes. This gets a really good push because within the new government, within the new pro-democratic, pro-European government, there are people, particularly at the sort of ministerial level, who are able to push this agenda forward. So this shows the importance of people at different levels in this context at the political decision maker level, the importance of supportive political leaders. What we're getting in this period is reports coming into the police, reports being recorded by the police. And then what happens is really, what we see is the very, very important role of civil servants who do a great job trying to record, trying to prosecute hate crimes that are being reported. So essentially what happens is that you have this small unit in the government that screens through every crime report that comes through, trying to look for evidence of possible hate crime, trying to look for evidence of possible bias motivation. And if the bias motivation is detected, then police officers are urged to investigate. And this is how cases actually start to come up. This is how the spreadsheet starts to populate. And this is supported by international organizations that come in, that provide training for prosecutors, for judges, and this starts to bring real good results. Particularly the result that you saw before, which is the 133 cases recorded in 1 year. How this is possible, apart from the technical assistance from international organizations, it's also possible because of this really smart approach taken by the people within the government who emphasize the European aspect of this kind of legislation and appropriate response to hate crime. So what happens is that people within the Ministry of Internal Affairs, within the prosecution services, if they frame something as a European obligation, then this is going to be expedited. This is going to be addressed much more quickly than if it was something minor, if it was less important, because the EU agenda is so high for that government at that period. And then in the last period, which is the period that we are currently in, all this progress that has been happening since 2016 suddenly comes to a halt. Actually, not that suddenly, because these things have been, so much unacknowledged that we don't really even know when things stop to work in a way. So it's difficult to tell whether a country has stopped to train the police. It's difficult to tell whether a country has sort of lost the momentum in terms of recording hate crimes, for example, because these things have been so kind of low profile that it was not possible to follow up on them that easily. So what we see is that sort of in the from the sort of public point of view, the issues that have been persistent, such as violence during Pride events, this has persisted over the years, since 2012, the first Pride event, to 2021, where violence led to a death. 2023, this year again, The Ministry of Interior promised that there would be protection for the Pride participants, and then failed to deliver the promise. So there are persistent problems, and these persistent problems also are now visible through the fact that some of the achievements that I mentioned before, so the achievements being ability to detect and record a good number of hate crimes, the training of the police, these achievements are now under threat if we consider the fact that the government has taken a much stronger pro-Russian approach or direction, that the EU ambitions, the Euro-Atlantic ambitions, are no longer that visible. At least the willingness to change the policies, to change the approach, is no longer so visible. So there are definitely some red flags, and these red flags have led to a situation where in 2022, right after the invasion on Ukraine, in 2022, Georgia, together with Ukraine and Moldova, applied for EU membership officially. But while Ukraine and Moldova actually obtained the official EU candidate status, Georgia did not. And Georgia's response to human rights or approach to human rights, Georgia's failure to continue with implementing the democratic reforms, including failure to address human rights violations, LGBTI human rights violations, has led to the EU sort of withholding this status for the time being. And in 2023, in a few weeks' time, Georgia is again going to be evaluated by the European Commission. The European Commission will then provide a recommendation whether Georgia should have the candidate status, the official candidate status, or not. And again, in this whole debate, Georgia's approach to LGBTI hate crime is something that is really very much in the public eye. Now I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to take 2-3 more minutes to just explain the theory and give you the main conclusions. So the theory that I wanted to test in this project was a theory of Europeanization. And Europeanization is this process within which countries, institutions take European norms, values, ways of doing things as their own, so implement them, accept them, sometimes change them. And there's different ways of trying to understand how Europeanization happens. So we are in the sort of now a mixture of political science and criminology when it comes to sort of the criminological topic of research, hate crime legislation, and political science sort of approach to public policies. And there are two models of Europeanization, two main models of Europeanization. One being external incentives, which means that we give you a list of tasks that we want you to do, and we give you a promise of something that you really, really want. And this is what quite often happens with candidate countries. So countries like Georgia that want to join the EU, they get a really good promise. So they have this carrot that they see, and quite often this will result in passing really good legislation that will not be implemented. And this has been the case in Georgia for over a decade. Now there is also another mechanism which is more about learning and socialization, and this is where you change your ways of doing things, you change your policies because you actually start to believe that this is the right thing to do. So these norms are more internalized, and then you would be much more likely to expect that actually not just the legislation but also the ways of doing things will be changed. So actually the laws would be implemented. This is much more expected in countries with stronger institutions, with stronger democratic traditions, perhaps with also stronger or higher LGBTI acceptance rates. So not necessarily expected in countries that are currently in the process of EU integration. However, I do think that sort of based on the some of the snippets of the results that I presented today, that actually this social part of Europeanization, this a really important work of people within the government, of people who are civil servants, who are politicians, who are elected officials, and they drive this agenda. I think this is really, really important. So it's not just the external incentives that take place, but it is also the real new important role of people within the government, of activists within the government, or change makers or change agents, who actually can really help to improve how states respond to hate crime. Now, as a conclusion, hate crime legislation is something that is quite difficult to implement, but evidence from Georgia, at least, now shows quite strongly that that you can have really good legislation, but you will not be able to properly address hate crime unless, apart from this legislation, you also have just strong institutions, well-functioning democracy, where hate crime legislation is just part of this broader package of rule of law and democratic institutions. So that's it for now. And I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Piotr. I will just stop the recording right there. Thank you for your presentation. Give me one second.